Good morning. This is the sixth lecture and for the second testing period of History 2303. And I'm checking the clock to be sure the timer is running, and we're actually rolling. In fact, it is. We talked last time about Texas during the Civil War and the contributions that individual Texans, some 135 major officers of the Confederacy were Texans during the Civil War. And we acknowledged four different distinct periods in which the Yankees tried to take military action in Texas. The first was when the Union Navy took Galveston, only to have John Magruder, transferred from Virginia with the express purpose of taking back Galveston, which he did on the last day, in the hours of the last day of December 1862, and the early hours of January 1, New Year's Day of 1863, taking Galveston back for the Confederacy. We then noted the efforts of Dick Dowling and his 43 Confederates at the Battle of Sabine Pass, and the great victory of Dick Dowling stopping a Yankee invasion of several thousand troops and dozens of Yankee ships at the Sabine Pass earned Dick Dowling and his men gold medallions in only two occasions, we said during class, and I think even on this tape, that only two occasions did the Confederacy honor their heroes on the battlefield, and this is one of those two occasions, honoring Dick Dowling and those who defended Sabine Pass against Yankee invasion in September of 1863. We then acknowledged that the Yankees would continue to attempt to take Texas, and a few months after failing to invade Sabine Pass, Nathaniel Banks, United States General at New Orleans, authorized an invasion of South Texas, and indeed, with several thousand men, Nathaniel Banks invaded with 6,000 Federals the island of Brazos de Santiago, which is the mouth of the Rio Grande River. From the mouth of the Rio Grande River, it was easy for Banks to take Brownsville and to shut off the illegal cotton trade that was going between Confederate Texas and Mexico. Jefferson Davis, early in the Civil War, had declared that the cotton crop should not be sold either to Europe or to suppliers in the North, that the Confederacy would withhold cotton and make the world, in a sense, come and get Southern cotton, particularly the Europeans, the French, the British, and those who were sitting on the fence in the American Civil War. But Texas farmers who were next to Mexico or near Mexico could harvest their crops as they did in 1862, 1863, 64, and even into 1865, and haul their cotton overland by wagon to Mexico. Then the same Texas farmers could defy the government of the Confederacy, orders not to sell cotton, and they could put their cotton on board a ship leaving from Matamoros, Mexico, because technically Matamoros was outside the scope of the American blockade of the southern coastline. The American blockade of the southern coastline went all the way from the Chesapeake Bay down to the southern tip of Florida into the Gulf of Mexico, but it ended at Brazos de Santiago. And of course, just on the other side, of the south side of the mouth of the Rio Grande, was the Mexican city of Matamoros. So Texas, unscrupulous cotton speculators, willing to make a great deal of money, because scarcity in cotton drove the price up from about 20 cents a pound to over 50 or 60 cents a pound in London. And so an unscrupulous Texas cotton farmer, who wanted to make money, put his crops on a ship headed to England, into Europe for sale at exorbitant prices, and that cotton in that shipping would be outside the scope of the Union blockade. The Union could not risk stopping ships coming out of Matamoros, Mexico, for fear of causing Mexico to join with the Confederacy against the United States of America. And so unscrupulous Texas farmers took advantage of the cotton trade. When Nathaniel Banks invaded South Texas, that temporarily forced the movement of cotton up to Laredo, about 100 miles inland along the Rio Grande border with Mexico, and Laredo became a very prime site for the exchange of cotton, illegal cotton, flowing out of Confederate Texas. And so the cotton trade was inhibited a bit when Nathaniel Banks invaded South Texas in late 1863. But from the Brazos de Santiago base, the Union forces took Brownsville. Over the next 2 months, Banks took Corpus Christi, Aransas Pass, Mustang Island, Indianola, and Lavaca, to the point that only Galveston and Sabine Pass was still left by late 1863 and early 1864 for Confederate shipping. In the spring of 1864, a third attempt by Nathaniel Banks was made to invade East Texas. From Alexandria, Louisiana, following the Red River, leading through Mississippi and into Texas, Union forces, some 25,000 strong, moved up the Red River with the intent of invading East Texas. A second force of 15,000 Federal troops marched southwestward from Little Rock, Arkansas, and these 15,000 were to team up with the 25,000 under Nathaniel Banks. In 1864, as East Texas was being potentially invaded by Yankee troops, the Confederate commanders in Texas, including Confederate General Kirby Smith, who was in charge of the Trans-Mississippi West Confederate Department, desperately needed as many men as he could to field a defending army. And Magruder asked for every available Texas man that could be freed up to develop a makeshift Confederate army to stop this invasion by Banks in 1864. With 8,000 cavalry, Confederate General Sterling Price stopped the 15,000 Federals marching from southwest from Little Rock, Arkansas, at the Battle of Camden, Arkansas. And then, just a week later, Confederate General Richard Taylor in Louisiana, with 11,000 troops, attacked and routed Banks' 25,000 Federal troops at Mansfield, taking 2,500 Union prisoners. The following day, after the Battle of Mansfield, Banks' forces repulsed Confederates the following day, but Banks got cold feet, was concerned that the Red River was dropping and that he would lose his means to retreat, and so after the second day of fighting at Mansfield, Banks retreated to the safety of Louisiana. It was in the summer of 1864 that Confederate Colonel John Ripford's Confederate forces recaptured Fort Brownsville, and pushed the Federals from the mainland onto the island of Brazos de Santiago. And we know that the last battle of the Civil War was fought near Brownsville on May the 13th of 1865 at a place called Palmetto Ranch, or Palmetto Hill, when Ripford and 300 Confederate soldiers defeated 2 Union black regiments and a company of unmounted Union cavalry. He took at the Battle of Palmetto Ranch. Ford took 111 Union prisoners, and from his prisoners, Ford was surprised to learn that Robert E. Lee, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, had surrendered at Appomattox 1 month before that, in April of 1865. Even after General Joseph Johnston surrendered to William Tecumseh Sherman in April of 1865, Texas Confederate Governor Murray, Confederate General Kirby Smith, and others insisted on continuing the war. And indeed, when Jefferson Davis fled Richmond, he was headed to Texas because he believed, as Kirby Smith and others, that the broad expanses of Texas had not been touched by Yankee troops, the interior of Texas, and that Texas was large enough that if he could escape with the Confederate government, the Confederates could continue the war effort in Texas. Now, Jefferson Davis was captured at Irwinville, Georgia, but he was headed to Texas. And so the Confederate Texans decided they would continue the war effort. And Kirby Smith, General Kirby Smith, only surrendered to Ulysses Grant after attempting to get even better terms of surrender than Grant had given to Lee at Appomattox. But finally, Kirby Smith surrendered in Galveston on June the 2nd of 1865. Governor Murray and General Kirby Smith immediately fled to Mexico, pledging temporarily not to live under Yankee rule. Magruder and former Confederate Texas Governor Edward Clark also fled the state. By the time that Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston on June the 19th of 1865, there was absolute chaos in Texas with the fall of the Confederate government. New President Andrew Johnson, in May 29th, had already granted conditional amnesty to those in Texas who had assisted the Confederates. And on June the 17th, Johnson had appointed A.J. Hamilton, a former Unionist, Texas Unionist, to be the post-war governor of Texas. But Hamilton was in Washington, D.C., making his way back to Texas. And so General Granger was to be in charge until Governor Hamilton arrived in the state. So without a governor present, General Gordon Granger's first act was to declare on June the 19th, 1865, that all Texas slaves, Negro slaves in Texas, was henceforth free. So therefore, June the 19th has been observed every year since then as Emancipation Day for Texas Negroes, because it was on June 19, 1865, that slaves of Texas learned that they were free because the war was over. During the Civil War, there was great conflict about the prosecution of the war in Texas. There was no doubt about it. Governors of Texas struggled, as Governor Lubbock did. He eventually entered Confederate service in 1863, but then Pendleton Murray, M-U-R-R-A-H, a very strong Confederate government supporter, became governor of Texas. And at times, the state of Texas quarreled with the federal government of the Confederacy. You know, the truth is that the southern states of America never have enjoyed strong federal control over the states, i.e. the southern states are states' rights oriented. They were before the Civil War, as they are now, states' rights oriented. So one can assume that if the states of the South believe that the national government before the Civil War was abusing their responsibilities, the same government officials weren't going to be very happy with Jefferson Davis and a strong national Confederate government. So you had a lot of states' rights-ism during the American Civil War. And on several occasions, Texans expressed negative opinions about the government of the Confederacy, and there were times when Jefferson Davis had to visit Texas, as other southern states, to buck up the resistance of the Confederate States and in order to continue the war effort. The reality is that the state of Texas in 1863 passed a law exempting all of those who had served in the frontier defense against serving in the Confederate regular army, because the concern was who was going to protect the frontier of Texas if the frontier regiment joined the regular Confederate army. And the governor simply refused to transfer state troops to Confederate authorities, and that was a problem because in 1864, when Banks attempted his Red River campaign, Pendleton Murray and others were very resistant to turning over Confederate state militia and allowing them to fight outside of Texas, even if it meant fighting in Louisiana to stop Banks' invasion. There were times that, as I said, at least on 2 occasions, that Jefferson Davis visited Marshall, Texas, and had conferences between the governor of Texas and the governor of Missouri. Marshall, of course, Yankee troops invaded Missouri early in the war, and Marshall, Texas was, believe it or not, a provisional capital of the Missouri government, state government in exile, the Confederate government in exile of Missouri during the Civil War. And he came twice in 1862 and 1863 to Marshall, Texas. The 1863 conference involved Texas governors, the Missouri governor, and Jefferson Davis, and the expressed concern was cultivating a relationship with Emperor Maximilian, etc. Emperor Maximilian, who had been installed by Napoleon III as the Emperor of Mexico during the American Civil War. And that's a subject we'll talk about later. But in other words, that Texans were not always happy with the national government of the Confederacy during the Civil War. During the Civil War, there was a dissent within the state of Texas. In the Red River counties along the Texas-Oklahoma territory, in the summer of 1862, the Texas Peace Party was formed, protesting secession, taxation by the Confederate nation, and particularly opposing the Confederate conscription law, the draft. The Dallas to Red River area was blatantly Unionist in sympathy, and as troublesome these Unionists were, Unionist sympathies was probably reasonably tolerated along the Red River. But in Central Texas, in 1861, German Unionists established the Union Loyal League with 500 members pledging their loyalty to the United States of America in Gillespie, Kerr, and Kendall counties. We sit in the middle of the Union Loyal League headquarters, stronghold. In July of 1862, Confederate authorities literally declared martial law against Kendall and Gillespie and the most eastern precinct of Kerr County, declaring that a state of rebellion existed among the Germans of Central Texas. And in July of 1862, Confederate authorities literally required the Union Loyal League to disband. Some Germans mistakenly thought that the governor, Lubbock, and the Texas legislature had somehow given Germans and those who were dissidents against the Confederacy 30 days to leave the state. And one group gathered at the headwaters of the Guadalupe River in western Kerr County and attempted to leave the state of Texas in August of 1862. What they didn't know is that about let's say 40 to 60 riders left and headed to Mexico on a leisurely about 15-mile-a-day journey. What these Germans didn't know is that there was a spy, a Confederate spy in the Union Loyal League, and the spy immediately acknowledged to Confederate authorities in San Antonio and at Fort Martin and Fredericksburg that these Unionist Germans were going to flee to Mexico because many of them intended to go to work for the United States government in the United States military. If they could flee to Mexico, they could take a ship outside of the Union blockade and at Matamoros and sail to Washington, D.C. and join the United States of America against the Confederacy. Confederate troops followed these Germans, and understand that Charles Schreiner had joined the Confederacy early in the war. He joined as a private, and there are some Texas historians and some local historians who say that Charles Schreiner was among the 50 or so riders who headed out to Mexico from the headwaters of Upper Turtle Creek in the north part of Kerr County. Some say that Charles Schreiner rode about 4 or 5 days with this group of Germans because he was trying to talk his younger brother Amy Schreiner out of fleeing to Mexico, because Charles Schreiner, we know, was a Unionist before the war. He had done business with the United States Army over at Camp Verde. They ran a store there and did business with the U.S. government. But Charles Schreiner's sympathies were with the Confederacy. He had joined the Confederate Army, a unit in San Antonio. But Charles Schreiner had not apparently yet gone to Confederate camp. And whether he was having second thoughts or whether he was trying to talk his brother Amy out of fleeing to Mexico, we know that Charles Schreiner and a handful of others left these Germans fleeing toward Mexico and returned home. The day after, Confederate troops caught up with these remaining Germans who were fleeing to Mexico in what was called the Battle of the Nueces, or the massacre at the Nueces River. Charles Schreiner received permission from a Confederate commander to report to his camp in Louisiana, and so either Charles Schreiner was at home before the Battle of the Nueces, or he had joined and he had yet to report to his company in Louisiana. But these Germans who were fleeing to Mexico, unaware that they were being pursued by Confederate troops, were overwhelmed as they were in camp early one morning in August of 1862 near Brackettville in what was called the Battle of the Nueces. 34 Germans were killed, and not all were killed during the battle. The Germans fought well, and they took a number of lives among the attacking Confederates, but the Germans were overwhelmed, and at least 7 or 8 were wounded and forced to surrender, and they were summarily executed, shot in the back of the head. So, and by the way, the bodies of these 34 Germans killed at the Battle of the Nueces were left where they fell. And after the war was over, a group of Germans from Comfort led a party down to the Nueces River and collected their remains. And the bones of those who were killed at the Battle of the Nueces are entombed in the True to the Union shrine in Comfort, Texas. Another group of 50 Central Texans were hanged and others killed before German resistance allegedly ended against the Confederacy. Critics of the war were often arrested, often without writ of habeas corpus. The best known case of that in Texas was Dr. Richard Peebles from Hempstead and 4 others who were arrested in October of 1863 on charges of plotting treason against the Confederacy. Peebles and two others were lucky. They eventually were exiled to Mexico. Again, most critics of the Confederacy were simply hung or bullwhipped to death or shot summarily. Others in North Texas, however, were not so lucky. 40 to 50 dissenting Unionists were hanged in North Texas, charged by People's Court, vigilante courts, extra-legal courts, and summarily executed. What was life like during the Civil War in Texas? Well, King Cotton was king, and even though Jefferson Davis had ordered that the southern population stop planting cotton and grow edible commodities like corn and wheat and other commodities that could feed the Confederate armies in the field. The reality is that Texans, tried to get by as best they could in an agricultural state during the American Civil War. In 1864, because there was a shortage of medicines in the Confederacy, there was a serious Confederate Texas effort to encourage the growing of poppies for opium. In Texas, newspapers focused attention on medicinal shrubs and plants in an effort to help families find homespun type remedies to maintain their health. Homespun clothing took on a patriotic fervor. Confederate Governor Lubbock, Francis Lubbock, was inaugurated in a homespun shirt, which he was proud to show off that his wife had made for him. And indeed, there was a shortage of manufactured goods throughout the Confederacy and throughout Texas. Ironworks were opened in Austin, Jefferson, and Rusk, and as an aside, a really unusual fact, the only cloth making machine west of the Mississippi River was, by chance, at the state penitentiary in Huntsville. And this cloth factory contributed 40% of the total Confederate war revenue during the Civil War that came from Texas. And, since it was the only cloth machine west of the Mississippi River, virtually everybody west of the Mississippi River dealt with and bought Huntsville-made cloth. As the federal naval blockade became more effective, the flow of Texas imports and exports literally dwindled to a trickle. Cotton had to be hauled overland, as we said, on the Rio Grande and placed on ships sailing from Matamoros so that the Mexican trade would be outside of the scope of the federal blockade. But smuggled Texas cotton could be sold in London or New York and other places abroad for as much as, my notes here say, $1.90, when before the war cotton wasn't even selling at 50 cents a pound. And so there was a lot of criticism among the Confederacy about, quote, unjust Texas speculators that took advantage during the Civil War. At this point, I think I want to end this particular tape, and we'll be probably taping at least 2 or 3, probably 3 more lectures. But until that time, I want to be able to upload this tape, and we'll talk about Reconstruction, the period after the war is over, because Texas, like the Confederate States of America, would have to be reconstructed back into the Union of the American nation. That was something that Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, was concerned about. They wanted Reconstruction to be easy, but the radical Republicans in the Congress wanted to punish the South and make Reconstruction anything but easy. And so we'll talk about Reconstruction in the days to come. But until then, I'll see you around campus, and I'll see you in the clouds. Bye.